than it would be to take the excommunication. Now, once you've been flogged, it might take a couple of weeks before you can come back after that sort of flogging. Because the whip they used to use, they'd get a long leather lash and they'd double it over so you'd have sort of two big cords, and they would that's what they used to flog you with. And so it would have been quite damaging. But here's my question. We've realised that Paul's a human. He wasn't some angelic being. You flog a person 40 times on 5 different occasions, what does that do to your back? How much scar tissue does that leave? What does that do to your posture? You've been flogged 40 times, from everything from the buttocks right up to the back of the neck. The physical scarring on the back of Paul, just from this Jewish punishment, what would that have looked like? And that wasn't all. He goes on, he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. This is the Roman punishment. And we read about one of these in Acts chapter 16. It says he was beaten so severely, and then they threw him in stocks, that the next day the Roman who was converted had to actually help to heal his wounds. The Romans didn't have any qualms about how many times they hit you. They just beat you until their arms were tired. Now, the person that did this, every governor in every city would have been accompanied by what was called a lictor, who was the disciplinarian. And what they had was a bundle of rods with an axe, and they would carry that around as a sign of their authority. In fact, this bundle was called a fasces, which is where we get the word fascism from. It's authoritarian rule. What these were was a symbol of authority, but if need be, if you're found guilty, you're brought up on trial, you were found guilty, you'll be flogged then on the spot. There was no jail system. It wasn't like you got 3 years or 5 years or whatever. Jails were only used until you were to be brought up on trial for whatever crime. But if they could punish you then on the spot, that's what they would do. Now here's the thing. Paul's a Roman citizen. You're not allowed to flog a Roman citizen. Remember what happened in Philippi? He gets flogged. The next day they come to say, hey, no, it's cool to go home. He says, hang on a second, I'm a Roman citizen. And they freak out because they flogged a Roman citizen, because you're not allowed to flog a Roman citizen. So on 3 different occasions, Paul, with his back faced to a Roman governor or to a Roman authority, accepted the flogging rather than say these simple words, I am a Roman citizen. Because those 4 words would have got him out of that punishment. But he didn't do it. Why? Well, because it's very hard for Paul, in a Roman city like Corinth or Philippi, to say to the poor, to those that are not citizens, who don't have that right, oh, I can get out of being persecuted, but you can't. So sorry. How can you relate to a person if you're not willing to go through the same thing that they're going to go through? So on 3 different occasions, Paul was flogged by the Romans, on top of scar tissue from the 200 lashes that he's already received from the Jews. What's that going to do to your back? I mean, surely that's got to hurt getting up in a cold morning, at the very least, if it hasn't twisted your posture somewhat. But that's not the end of the story. Not by a long shot. It says, once I was stoned. Now, this isn't Paul in the 60s going through his experimental phase. This is, they threw rocks at his head until he was going to die. They wanted him dead. And we read about this actually in Acts 14. Talks about this when he was there in Lystra. When they used to stone a person, what the Jews used to do was they'd take you up into a high platform and they'd throw you off. Not like a cliff, but maybe a high roof or something. They'll throw you off with the idea being that the fall should kill you. Maybe it'll break your neck or whatever it is. But in the event that it doesn't kill you, somebody would come along with a big rock and they'd drop it on your head. And if that didn't work, on your chest. That's right, they drop it on your chest. If that didn't work, if that didn't kill you, then they pelt you with rocks. So you remember the time when Jesus is in the synagogue, he's pretty sure it's back in Nazareth, but whatever. He was in the synagogue and they got really fired up, because he was saying that he was the fulfillment of Isaiah. And so they took him up to a high place and they were about to throw him off. What were they going to do? They were going to stone him. And we're talking about some Echo Point type cliff that, 15-minute fall sort of thing. Where he was actually very flat. So we might have been talking about something the height of, a couple of story building. But the idea was they were going to throw him off as a part of the process of stoning him. So Paul has been stoned. Somewhere in Lystra, they've taken him up onto a high place, they've thrown him off, they've dropped a rock on him in case he hasn't been killed then, and then probably pelted him with rocks, and they've left him for dead. Or left him assuming he was dead. Why did they assume he was dead? Because he was dead. Like, you don't get rocks pelted at your head and survive to tell the story. You actually die. But then these crazy Christians got around and prayed for him, and he came back to life. And I can imagine how frustrated he would have been with them, because finally he's going into his glory, and then they pray and he's coming back and he's like, oh crap, now I'm going to get more of this sort of stuff. Thanks, guys. I'm sure it wasn't like that. But getting rocks pelted at your head, rocks big enough, am I talking little pebbles, right? It's not like throwing gravel at him. We're talking rocks that are big enough to do some damage. What's that going to do to your head? Brain damage, perhaps? Paul says to the Galatians, I bear the marks of Christ on my body. That wasn't a metaphor. He says, you want proof? Here, look at my back. Look at my head. Look at the scars. I bear the physical marks of Christ on my body. This is the price that I've paid for this calling that God has called me towards. Oh, I'm sorry, Corinthians, you wanted these great stories. Well, this is all I got. It's just a life of suffering. But this is why I know that I really am a servant of Christ. But he doesn't stop there. There's plenty more of this to come. So join me in the next video. Well, Paul's only just got started. That's just the floggings and the stoning. Let's be honest, right? If any of us in sort of a Western church, in quite very privileged circumstances, was ever flogged for the gospel, even once, I mean, quite seriously, we would be on the preaching circuit. We would be writing the book about the time we got flogged for Jesus and the trauma that we experienced. We'd be on the preaching circuit. We'd be going around telling our story everywhere, showing the scars. I mean, look at what they did for me in the name of Christ. And it would just be a pivotal moment in our lives. Paul gets flogged, and it's like, oh, it's Tuesday. Oh, flip, that week went quickly. I mean, this is just part of life for him. He goes on, he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. So 3 times he reenacts the last scene of Titanic, right? He's out there in the Mediterranean, and he's just floating around a piece of board. Now, seriously, you shipwrecked once, you're saying, God, this is crap, this is ridiculous. You shipwrecked twice, you're saying, all right, now it's just getting stupid. You shipwrecked 3 times, you're saying, God, are you kidding? Like, are you unoriginal? Is there anything else we could try? I mean, come on, we've done the shipwreck thing. What else have you got for me? Oh, a night and a day I was adrift at sea. Out in the Mediterranean. Don't know if anyone's going to come and pick you up. Obviously somebody did. But a night and a day out in the sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, like these idiots over here. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. It's just been a life on the run. It's just one bad experience after the other. We go, forget this Christianity thing. Paul says, I know I'm on track. I know I'm still on course, because this is what's happening to me. Because my life seems to be lived in accord with the same sufferings that Christ himself experienced. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Another thing that really bothered Paul the most, the thing that really weighed him down the most, you think, okay, in just sort of, even in sort of modern psychological understanding, you get flogged once, that's going to maybe do some psychological damage. You get flogged 5 times by the Jews, 3 times by the Romans, and you're stoned to death. That's got to take a psychological toll. Then spending a life on the run, continually in fear, not waking up every morning convinced that today's the day. And if you get to the end of the day, you've done well. I mean, that's got to take a psychological toll. And yet the thing that actually crushed Paul was his children in Corinth doing what they've just done. Forget the beatings. That's just part of life. That's just the Roman Empire at best. It's just being a Christian at worst. That's whatever. You just take that in your stride. He says the thing that really kills me, the thing that really weighs on my soul most heavily, beyond all of the beatings and everything else, is my concern for the churches. Because when something goes wrong in one of those churches in the ancient world, there's no internet. You can't pick up a phone and say, guys, put that idiot on the phone, let's deal with this. It's a letter, which takes months. And you don't know what's happening. You don't know if it's going to work. And then it's more months before you get a response. Maybe it's 6 months. You don't know what's going to happen in that 6 months. And so for Paul, the only thing he has at his disposal is prayer. That's all he's got. Besides all the floggings, besides everything else. I mean, that just astounds me. Everything Paul's experienced for this last 12 months, that's the thing that weighs on his soul. That's the thing that almost crushes him. It's not the physical abuse. It's the spiritual devastation. And he says, who is weak? And I'm not weak. Who is made to fail? Who is made to fall? And I'm not indignant. He says, you think I don't get tempted? You don't think Satan's coming after me every single day? Here's the thing with the enemy. He doesn't need to take out 100 people if he can take out the leader. He doesn't need to take out some pleb somewhere. He just needs to take out the head, and everything else will crumble. He knows that. So you think about the early church. You think about everything that Paul has done. Because here we are still 2,000 years later talking about the guy. Do you not think that he was prime target number one of the enemy? Do you not think he probably mustered an army to try to take Paul down? I mean, if we're talking spiritual terms, Paul is primary target. He's who you need to take down. And we've seen this, right? You've seen this happen. You've seen some great minister who's climbed and the pinnacle of ministry and, international fame, and then they fall. And what happens? The ripples of devastation just continue on internationally. It kind of serves as a warning not to aspire to that position unless you're ready for that sort of attack. Because that's who the enemy's coming after. So Paul says, you don't think I've got the enemy on my tail? Like every day? At a purely practical level, Paul's a single man. He's a single man, a single male human being. Single, no longer married, maybe widowed, maybe divorced. You don't think he had any temptation? Paul has seen people raised from the dead. You don't think just for a moment he might think, hey, maybe I could get some credit for myself. Hey, Jesus, maybe do you want to share some of that credit? Maybe you want to say, praise Paul. You don't think for a minute in his weakest moments he might have just had some temptation towards a little bit of pride? Because that's all it would have taken to unravel him. And you don't think the enemy was at him on a constant basis. So for the floggings, it's fine. They just remind me that I'm alive. The thing that really gets me is when my church absolutely destroys my life and when the enemy comes after me on a daily basis. That's the real thing. That's the real killer. He says, if I'm going to boast, I'll boast about the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, he who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. In the Roman army, one of the top prizes, one of the top military honors you could win was what was called the Corona Muralis. That is, it's the wall crown. It's the crown or the military award given to the general who manages to scale a wall and to take a city on the other side of the wall. Because if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you know that's difficult, right? I mean, the way those poor orcs go getting slaughtered trying to take the city, it's not easy. Right? Not that I've ever tried it, but you can imagine trying to scale a wall and take it, it's going to be difficult. If you manage to do that, that deserves a great honor. So you're the general that scaled the wall. Paul kind of plays up that thing and he says, yeah, when I was in Damascus and it all hit the fan, I was the first guy down the wall. I kind of fled. So if you're looking for the great general, the great military leader of an apostle, yeah, I'm not him. Yeah, I was the first dude down the wall, so I can't even help you there. He says, if I must go on boasting, though there's nothing to be gained by it, I'll go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Right, so when Paul says here, I know a man, he's actually talking about himself. If you're going to boast, this is one of the ways you can do it. You can talk about somebody else, but everybody knows you're talking about yourself. So Paul says, that's right. He says, there was this one time where I went to heaven. And they're like, huh? They've been sitting through all this suffering. And Paul's like, oh, yeah, miracles, yeah. So there was this time I went and sat with Jesus and hung out with Jesus. You know, we went to had a coffee. Great guy. You'll love him when you meet him. And they're like, oh, you've got to be kidding me, Paul. Like, you've been holding out on us. You know, you're sure raising the dead. That's impressive. But you actually went to the third heaven. Yeah, it was a pretty cool day. What happened? I can't tell you. What was said? Can't really tell you. Inexpressible words. You had to be there. But we weren't. Tell us. I'm sorry. If you weren't there, well, maybe you're just not so special. Maybe. Paul says, on behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast. Except in my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think of me more than he sees in me or hears from me. Here's the thing. I could boast about all sorts of crazy stuff. I have seen miracles that would blow your mind. Right, you want to talk about a CV? Man, I've got a CV. It is impressive. And he says, you know what? It's not going to make any difference. It's not going to change anything. If you want me to out-compete these super apostles, I'll show you that I'm a super-duper apostle. It's not going to change anything. It's ultimately not going to fix this issue that's going on in your hearts. Because if everything I've done with you, if the integrity that I've shown in all these years is not enough for you, then nothing will be. If you need more's not going to help this. If the relationship that we have isn't enough for you, then nothing else is going to fix this. So I'm not going to bother with it. I'll allude to something, you know what? It's not going to change anything. If the scars on my back, the scars on my head aren't enough to prove that I'm a genuine apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, if your very salvation, the transformation that you've seen in your life and your community isn't enough proof that God is at work in me, then none of it's going to matter. So you know what? What you see is what you get. This is it. This is me. Take it or leave it. Well, there's one more thing he needs to say here. And let's just save this to the final video when we come to close this thing up. See you in a moment. So with all that said, with all of the sufferings and everything that Paul's been through, he kind of lets slip a little bit. Maybe he kind of gets in the zone. Maybe he's sort of like, hey, maybe I will have a go at this boasting thing legitimately. Maybe I'll just kind of allude to some things, this great time that I had up in this third heaven. Maybe. But in the moment, I think that when Paul's writing this, probably all of these thoughts started to flood into his mind, all of these memories, all of these things that he's seen and done and experienced. And maybe just for a moment he reflects on that. And he realizes actually God was doing something pretty profound through all of that experience. In fact, the potential of all of those kinds of incredible miracles and experiences that he's been through, it could very easily lend a weaker person to become quite arrogant, quite boastful, much like these super apostles. And so he reflects on it and he says, you know, but God, even from the potential of my boasting, did something to redeem me. And remember, we've talked a lot about suffering. Paul says, to prevent me from maybe going down too far with this, getting all up myself about it, he says, God did something for me. He says to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. We don't like this verse, because this verse makes very clear that sometimes God will allow something to hinder us so that we would recognize that it's not by our strength. It's not by our strength. Paul says God allowed this thorn. He said, I was aware of it. He said 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. I didn't want it. But God knew that for this life, I needed it. And so he said to me this, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. For Paul, that was a revelation. For Paul, that was the defining moment, the characteristic of his ministry. He's already said to the Romans, rejoice in your suffering. This is what he says about this one. He says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. I'll take pride in the sufferings. I'll rejoice in the sufferings. Because in doing so, the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. He says, guys, in summary, you want my CV? Here it is. There's only 2 things on it. Just 2. There's the abundance of my weakness, and there's the abundance of his grace. That's all I've got. Everything else is to the glory of God. There's no room for boasting. There's nothing else that can be said for that. And so for these Corinthians, he says, look, it's a case of take it or leave it. But if it's still about the money, well then let me say this to you. He says, first of all, I've become a fool. But you forced me to it. You actually pushed me into this corner. That I would even have to venture down this path of having to say this rubbish about myself. That I have to tell you this stuff that just doesn't need to be talked about. That you pushed me into it. He says, I would have been commended by you. For I was not inferior at all to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. Just a final jab at these super apostles. I am not inferior at all to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. So I'm better than the super apostles, and I'm nothing. So what does that make them? Well, less than nothing. They don't even have the dignity of being able to say that they're nothing. They're somewhere less than that. He says, you want proof? He says, well, just use your memories. The signs of a true apostle were performed amongst you with the utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. You saw enough to know. For in what were you less favoured than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Why forgive me this wrong? For Paul, this is ministry. It's got nothing to do with him, and it's all to do with serving those that God has graced us with. And so for 5 years now, Paul has been in this rocky relationship with these Corinthians. And yet throughout all of it, has continued to serve, continued to lay down his rights, continued to lay down his life for the sake of them. Because he realizes that in this relationship, he's the father. He's the one that's called to sacrifice for them, not the other way around. And so he'll continue to serve and continue to serve. This was his last shot. But what's so fantastic about it is that it worked. It was stupid that it had to get this far. But the great thing is this, that it worked. Because we know that after this, he ended up in Corinth, from where he wrote Romans. And there's some suggestion, and it's another story for another day, but there's actually some suggestion that the house that he stayed in, well, we know that the house that he stayed in was the house of Gaius. He says that in Romans 16. But there's actually some suggestion that maybe it was actually Gaius who caused all this problem in the first place. So we have reconciliation to the point where not only has there been friendship reconnected, but that then Gaius would even come back to serve Paul. And so it's an incredible picture. If that's the case, and it's a very good argument to suggest that it is, this thing's come full circle. And just the power of reconciliation, the power of restoration, what Paul had been praying for and agonizing over for this last 12 months, it came back in spades. So it's an amazing story of ministry. And I hope that you've taken a lot out of this, but it's a beautiful set of letters. And I'd really encourage you just to go back through them now, read them in the light of the way that we've discussed them, and just let them permeate into your ministry, into your Christian life. Just get a sense of the heart of Paul, and just say, God, how do I replicate this into the people that you have given me the great and incredible gift of being able to look after? That would be my challenge to you from here on in. Thanks so much for being with me.